Hello, Gavin Lazarus here today to talk to you about the Burns Club Marquee series guitar, which I have in my hands now. What is it? Why is it? And what have I learnt about setting this thing up to be a good, playable and usable guitar? Because after all, how many guitars do you need? Just one more, just one more. So in this video, I'm going to talk to you about this particular guitar. We'll come to all the settings and the controls on this in a little while, including clearing up the mystery about this pull-out knob here, this tone control that pulls out and gives you access to different sounds. We'll talk about exactly what that is. I've heard people saying it might be a phase inversion or something. It's not that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. We'll also come to something that I learned about this guitar, which really helped me to make it into a usable, playable guitar. It's just a little thing which you could easily overlook, and in fact I did overlook, and the luthier I gave it to also overlooked. That meant that the setup on this was a little bit tough. Also, I'm going to throw in a little history of Jim Burns and Burns guitar users, just an indication of some of that information out there. As usual, please like and subscribe. It's important to all us YouTubers, so just take a little bit of time to do that. That'd be lovely. I also welcome your comments and your input on this. I don't claim to be a Burns expert or an expert on any of these things. I'm just sharing the knowledge that I do have on this and my experience as a user. So I'm really keen to hear about other Burns users and how you work your guitar and how you set it up and what you use it for. And also anybody who has more information about Jim Burns and anything related. There's a lovely little video about the Burns factory in the very early 60s from Pathe News. I'll put a link to that here as well. It's very amusing, especially the commentary on there, talking in very disparaging terms about rock and roll guitar players out there. Good fun, and I'll put a link to that as well. So, Jim Burns, James Ormston Burns, who was born in 1925 in England. When he was a late teenager, he joined the RAF, and I believe it was there that he learnt electronics. Following his stint in the RAF, he studied got an apprenticeship as a joiner. So there he was in the 1950s, a keen amateur guitar player, musician, and he had the dual skills of electronics and carpentry. Wonderful, especially when you're in the 50s and rock and roll has exploded, and that explosion soon made the guitar, and very specifically the electric guitar, the weapon of choice for rock and roll and rock music and indeed pop music going forward for decades to come. There is a problem, of course, however, because in England you can't get hold of all the great American guitars. You can't get a Fender, you can't get a Gibson, you can't get a Gretsch or a Rickenbacker for love nor money. And that's because of the import and export agreements between the countries, or disagreements, I should say. The trade laws between the countries meant you just couldn't get hold of those. The first Strat to enter these shores, I believe, was brought in by Cliff Richard as a gift for Hank Marvin, his lead guitarist of his backing group, The Shadows. Well, they were his backing group, but they were also a great group in their own right. So the Brits were getting, the young aspiring rock and rollers from the UK were getting their guitars from Hofner and Honor and other German brands, from Dutch brands like Egmonds, which were pretty ropey. And in fact, John Lennon got his first guitar, his first acoustic guitar, from South Africa of all places, a Gallo, and it was a pretty dodgy instrument. So most of them were playing. There were some high-end versions of those guitars, from those manufacturers, which were not bad at all. But a lot of them were very cheaply made and not good quality. And they largely tended to be in the archtop style, so jazz-style guitars. The solid body ones were even worse than the archtop ones, generally speaking, cheaply made and thrown out jobs, with a few notable exceptions. I won't get into that now. So there was a gap in the marketplace for English manufacturers of electric guitars. Now, of course, Watkins started to make some. They were making their Dominator amps and things like that, and their Westminster amps. Then, and they branched out into guitars as well, particularly their Rapier series of guitars. But Jim Burns became the leader in that, in British manufacture of electric guitars, became known as the British Leo Fender of the time, which is kind of fair because he was the most innovative, the most progressive of British manufacturers, and made the biggest splash on the market too. And he started out, he made some under, I think it was called the Soundcraft label, or brand, and it was an unnamed guitar. I've put it up on the screen there, quite a fair looking thing. That didn't last. He only made those for sort of a year, and then he teamed up with a guy called Henry Wheel, who basically bankrolled making of the Burns-Weil guitars. Not the best looking things I've ever seen, I have to say. I've got the pictures of them there. And that only lasted a year or so as well. And this became a recurring theme for Burns, because while he was a great inventor, great innovator, and designer, he was not an astute businessman. And this came back to bite him a few times over during his career. The failure of that collaboration set him off on the course of probably the golden era then, 1960 to 1965, where he sets out on his own, starts manufacturing. The stars aligned for him a little bit, and you can read a bit about that and how he was able to start manufacturing his own guitars under the Burns brand during that era. And this is where all the really iconic, famous Burns things come up. His trisonic pickups, beloved, of course, of Brian May, and used on his self-made Red Special with his dad in his shed, or however the legend goes. Those trisonic pickups were used in early Burns guitars and carried on being used. Very famous Resomatic pickups as well, and in fact this has the Resomatic pickups in it. And you get things like the Bison design with its big long horns, and you get the New Sonics and the Vibrasonics and the short scale jazz ones, lots of bass guitars as well. And then of course you come to this design with that very, very famous scroll top headstock, which was another one of his innovations. And this particular design was done hand in hand with the great Hank Marvin, who was looking for something, and collaborating with Jim Burns seemed an obvious fit. This was sort of 62, 63, they were working on the development of the Marvin guitar. And Burns rolled these out for Hank, and another one for Bruce Welch, which I believe didn't have the tremolo on it, because Bruce was just playing rhythm, didn't want that. And of course the bass version, which was used by the then Shadows bassman and the bassman for the majority of the 60s, the great John Rostill. So they all had matching sets in Shadows white with black pick cards and the white backing. And of course the fancy tremolo design, which this does not have. So there were lots of other designs and other users at that sort of time. Maybe some notable ones would be Vic Flick, he of James Bond theme fame, and many, many others. I mean, fantastic session player was Vic Flick, and he used Burns guitars from time to time. And of course, another excellent claim to fame would be the Beatles, because when McCartney wasn't playing bass on some of the Beatles tracks, George Harrison usually reached for a Burns New Sonic bass guitar and used it on some of those tracks in 1965 and 66, and even I think in 67, before they started using some Fender instruments towards the end. You can see them in Get Back, and they're using a Fender Precision, or is it a Fender 6? Anyway, so Beatles endorsement there, not bad though. I think Spencer Davis Group also used some Burns instruments, and you see them over various other groups as well during the 60s. I think the Searchers might have even used some Burns instruments from time to time. Honeycombs, probably. Anyway, a few to mention. Later on, with the reissued Burns and with using vintage guitars, luminaries such as Mark Knopfler occasionally used them, Christine from Blondie, Gaz Coombs definitely from Supergrass, Graham Coxon from Blur, and of course Billy Bragg famously used them as well. There have been many, many other users over the time, and I think there's information online as to all the people who've used Burns over time. That's just a little snapshot into some of the players. In 1964, he made the Wild Dog, and that was a gnarly setting that is now incorporated, I think, on the Bison guitars, but it was an innovation in 1964, 65, started making the Wild Dog ones. But then he ran into the usual financial difficulties, and it meant that he had to sell up to the Baldwin Piano and Organ Company, which he did in 1965. The real tragedy is such were his financial hardships that he had to sign over the Burns name as well. So he didn't have control over that name anymore. And guitars then came out with the Baldwin brand, sometimes with the Baldwin Burns brand, but Burns himself wasn't able to make any more Burns guitars with his own name on them, so he went out and made other brands during the late 60s and throughout the 70s, which I won't go into because it's beyond the brief of this particular guitar. So anyway, that's it on the Jim Burns history. Let's move on to this guitar and its tones. So this is not a vintage guitar. Well, it probably is now because it's definitely about 25 years old. This is from the reissue. They did reissue some in the 80s, but this is from the late 90s and 2000s reissue that they made. It's Korean made and made from 1999 onwards to, I think, about 2004. Now, this is one of the earlier ones, 1999 or 2000. The reason for that is it's got no truss rod access on the neck. They came after that with the truss rod cover and truss rod access on the neck. And if I'm absolutely honest, I wish I had one of those, because not having the truss rod access on there is a pain. You have to take the bolts off there and do your neck adjustment, loosening off all the strings and all that stuff. Now, I know that's not unusual. There's a lot of vintage guitars where you've got to do that, but I always prefer it if you can just get in at the top of the guitar and make your neck adjustments while you're in, without the hassle. Anyway, so it's Korean made, 25.5-inch scale, 22 frets with a 0 frets. It is an alder body, and let me tell you, it's a weighty body. I don't have the weight of it on me, which is a bit remiss. Maybe I'll try and put that in the comments, but it's a chunk. It's definitely considerably heavier and bigger than a Strat, which of course it is a Strat shaped and it's trying to do the job of a Strat, but it's a beefier bit of kit than a Strat for sure, and with a much longer sort of feel on the neck than any Strat that I've played. It is a maple neck, this, and of course it's got a 3-piece scratch plate, it's got 3 Resomatic pickups, and it's got all the sort of gold hardware on it, on the tuners and on the trem system. It's got the usual settings that you would expect. So you've got a bridge in position 1, bridge in middle, and neck pickup, just like a Strat. And then, of course, it has got this pull-out. And this pull-out selector gives you 2 extra options, which I will come to in a moment. So, let's hear some tones. I've got everything dimed on the guitar, so volume, tone, maximum. and I'm going through a Fender Hot Rod DeVille. It's set very, very clean. I've got a little bit of plate reverb coming through from the Strymon Flint pedal, but that's it. So it's set very clean. Here's the bridge pickup. Let's just add a little bit of kick to that. I'm going to use my trusty Dr. Robert pedal from Aklam, and I've just got it so it's kicking it a bit harder. Here we go. There is. A little bit of the trem arm there as well. Plenty of quack there, then, isn't there? That's with the Dr. Robert just kicked in on that. Let's move to the middle position and see how thick this is. Quite rich and full. Yeah, pretty full. Don't think it'll need the kick in. Right, let's move to position 4. A little bit muddy perhaps, definitely got that quack, but you're getting that sort of mud. Slightly different EQ on the Dr. Robert pedal is brightening that up a little bit. I think if I was using that setting, I'd want to probably get a bit of clarification from somewhere. But it's doing what you'd expect it to do. Those two, middle and the neck pickup with a bit of quack. Let's go to full-on neck. Okay, the Dr. Robert. possibly a bit boomy for the rhythm sounds, but comes in quite nicely when you're playing lead lines. Which brings me to the next setting very nicely, because I will now reveal to those of you who don't know, apologies to those of you who do, what this pull-out does. So if I pull that out and move it to position 1 again, what I've now got is not any phase inversion or anything like that. What I've got is the neck pickup and the bridge pickup combined. So those two. Here it is. With the Dr. Robert. So if you move that on now to position 2, what you get is all 3. So I slammed on the Dr. Robert sort of halfway through that. Okay, so those are the tones on this guitar. But I do find those extra 2 settings are really useful. And in fact, all of the tones on here I find usable, although I really probably, in honesty, don't use the neck and the middle pickup on the normal settings really at all. But all the other ones I find really usable. And the last 2, position 1, the neck and the bridge together, I find is a great lead tone, particularly if you roll off a little bit of the tone. There isn't a separate volume for the neck and the bridge pickup on here, like there is on my Gretsch, but this is like a Strat, so it doesn't have that. But if you roll back the tone on that neck pickup, the bridge sort of is the more pushy of those 2 pickups, and you get a really good lead sound. And with all 3 of them on, so in position 2 with the pull-out, you get a really good rhythm sound. It sits very comfortably and naturally underneath vocals or lead instruments. So very, very usable. The other thing about this is if you want to get those sounds specifically of the shadows from 64 onwards, that classic Marvin, Welsh, Rostill, Bennett lineup and all those tunes that they used to play, this is the one to do it with. It's distinctly different from the Strat in that respect. So tunes like Rise and Fall of Fingal Bunt, you need one of these if you're going to accurately get that right in a way that the Strat gets close but doesn't quite do it. And in fact, I'm going to do a different video on the similarities and differences between this Burns and a Fender Strat. I'll put the links below to that video when I make it. You will see that there are some differences in the sounds that they make and therefore what you can do with the guitars. Now, on to the technical point that I was going to raise. So obviously I mentioned before that there's no truss rod access to there. Bit of a pain. If you get the ones beyond, I think, 2000, you will get a truss rod cover. So be careful to look for that if it's important to you when you are looking for one of these in the used marketplace, because if I was looking again, I definitely would be looking for that. The second point to bring to your attention is all about the trem system, the Point Classic trem. Now you can see that that's where mine is sitting. So you can see quite a lot of the kit below it. I've got it sitting a little bit high there, but that used to be sitting way, way higher than that and at a weird angle as well. When I first got the guitar, because of the truss rod axis and this unfamiliar trem system, I sent it off to a luthier to get it set up. He did the job and it came back and it was okay. And I played it, did a few gigs with it, and then I put it down, didn't really go back to it very often, which is always a sign. And then I had some shows coming up where I had to do that specific sort of shads and mid-60s sound, and I wanted to play this again. So I sent it back to him, and he set it up again. And sadly, I actually wasn't very happy with the results of that. The bridge was sitting very high and very awkwardly, and there wasn't much movement in the tremolo. I couldn't get any upward movement really at all, and get a bit of down, and it was a short and sort of quite unnatural sounding vibrato. And so, I mean, I did use it and got by on those couple of shows, and then I decided, right, take it apart yourself, get familiar with this, let's sort this out. And it took me 2 or 3 goes on this. I adjusted the neck on it, and then I started trying to get this tremolo system to sit a little bit better in the guitar. And every time I attempted it, I couldn't really do it. Now, I'm not going to take it apart for you here now because it was a pain enough doing it in the first place. But I'll put some pictures up showing the tremolo system there for you. But basically, there are 2 points, little sort of conical points, that act as a fulcrum for the tremolo to work on. And those points sit in a plate. There's only one place they can sit, and those points are marked out on that plate. You sit it in there, drop it in, and then you make the adjustments as usual via the back plate with your springs, just like you would on a Strat. So you can either get it dead flat and solid to the back, or you can have any amount of relief that you want on that trem unit. The problem was that it just wasn't sitting right, and every time you couldn't get it flat. Actually, you could not get that down flat to the body of the guitar. And what I discovered was there are 2 little points for Allen key on those points inside, and they weren't tight. It was as simple as that. When I tightened them up with the Allen key and they were rigid in place, the whole thing went boop, slotted straight in, sat perfectly, and that enabled me to get it to the position that I wanted it. You could put it in any position that you want once those 2 things are rock solid and tight. So you must check that they are tight in their plate, otherwise you're gonna have a world of pain trying to get this set up to where you want to play it. It now plays exactly as I like it. It's a beautiful guitar, and I really use this a lot now. And actually one of my bandmates who came around and was noodling away on this guitar commented on how lovely it was to play the other day. So it works very nicely there. So do look out for that on your point tremolo systems. I welcome any further input you Burns users out there have, particularly ones who've got this guitar. How do you set it up? What are your special tips on using this guitar to its max? Obviously the clips I've done were on a very clean setting. There's loads you can do, and I didn't want to faff about too much with a whole load of different settings. There will be other demos of people showing the tones that you can get out of this guitar on YouTube, I'm sure. I tend to use slightly thicker strings on these lower ones, so I use a medium gauge, but I use slightly thicker on the E and the A. That's how I use it. But I'm really keen to hear from Burns users. I'm also keen to hear from people who've got the wild dog setting on a Bison. Keen to hear from people who've used the Burns Double Six, their 12 string. I've heard really, really good things about that, although I've also heard it is a beast to hold, so don't do it if you've got a bad back. But I've heard it's great playing and great sounding 12 string guitar, which obviously you get much cheaper than, say, a Rickenbacker 12. I'm keen to hear from any of you who've used the new Sonics or have a new Sonic bass. Any of you who've used the Vibrasonics or those short scale jazz style guitars. What are they like? Who's got the proper Marvin? The Marvin with the proper big old tremolo system, the beautiful trem system that Hank helped to design. Love to hear from you, and if you've got one of these and one of those, what are the main benefits? I mean, obviously that the Marvin's going to be better. This is the budget version, which I forgot to mention, this is kind of the budget version of that. And who's got some of the more outlandish designs from Burns? Obviously, I mentioned earlier in the piece that he was framed as the Leo Fender, the British Leo Fender, and I did see another commentator suggesting he was more like the British Fred Gretsch, because his designs were so quirky, and the best of them were absolutely jaw-dropping. The worst of them were maybe a bit on the wrong side of out there. So what do you think? What do you think of Burns? Are you, I presume if you're watching this, you are a Burns user. So let's have all your Burns stories out there. Anyway, many thanks from me, and I'll see you again with another guitar, because after all, how many guitars do you need?